Right. Welcome to Bible Basics Lesson 6. Today we're going to be looking at the Old Testament poetry and wisdom books. And these are the books that go from Job through the Song of Solomon. So we're going to be looking at Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon this morning. We're not going to look at them specifically in that order, but we will get to all of them as we go through. As we begin, I want to talk just a minute about what poetry is and what wisdom is. When we talk about poetry, we're basically talking about style. Okay? So poetry, and specifically the Old Testament poetry, it's written in a style that contains a noticeable rhythm and a noticeable meter. Okay, and when we translate from Hebrew to English, we lose some of that, but you can still kind of get the feel that there is a pattern to how this is written. And we want to remember that, up until now, we've been reading, stuff that's historical narrative. Now we're going to be reading things that's more poetic. And poetry is more concerned with painting a word picture than it is being rigidly accurate. Okay, so we do this using analogy and metaphor. We say that, God is our refuge and strength. Well, God is not literally a refuge and strength. He is symbolically those things. So we do things through analogy and metaphor to find out what God is like rather than what he specifically is. So that's the way God relates to us. He says, you see that, that rock, I am like that rock, or I'm like a shepherd. He uses things that we understand so that we can understand what he is like. One of the things that we'll notice, and we'll look at this specifically, is that Hebrew poetry often consists of parallel lines that each line is used to in some way amplify or differentiate the other. So sometimes it's, you'll have a line of poetry and then the next line is telling you the same thing, but in a different way, maybe in a greater or lesser way. Sometimes you'll have a line and then the next line is the opposite of that. It'll differentiate what that is. And we'll kind of see that as we go through again. And oftentimes, in Old Testament poetry, a lot of this was set to be sung to known tunes, and we see that specifically in the Psalms. So when we talk about wisdom literature, we're not so much talking about the style as in what it's talking about. So the wisdom literature is generally concerned with telling us how the world works and how we are to live in the world. So the wisdom writings instruct us on how to live godly lives in various seasons and stages of life. Okay, one of my professors in seminary remarked. He said, wisdom is the art of godly living, and so that's kind of how we work our way through that. So we're actually going to start not in the book of Job, but we're going to start in the Psalms. Again, looking at, this is our biggest collection of Hebrew poetry that we have. And the Psalms were written by various authors. There's 150 of them in the book that we have. We know that King David wrote a lot of them, but he didn't write all of them. Some were written by a man named Asaph. Some were attributed to the sons of Korah. Some were written by Moses. And some are not credited at all. Okay? But the book of Psalms collected these poems that were used to be sung in public worship to God. Okay, so and this is important because the Psalms, the singing of these Psalms, were meant to be instructive to the people. Okay, they were to inform the people about who God is, what he's done, and how we are to live according to his law. And we know that music is very, very important um, in how we live. Music affects us in a number of ways, and and God is using that as a way to instruct His people. So when we sing not only to God, but we actually sing to each other in a way of affirming and declaring what it is that we believe. And I mean, you even see this with music today. I mean, you talk to folks today, and one of the questions that you might ask somebody to find out a little bit more about them is, well, what's on your playlist? Because everybody's got their devices and they've got music that they like, and you find out what kind of music they like. You can find out something about them. And so the music that we sing, especially as Christians, especially in church, tells us something about who we are and what we believe. Um, so these poems that we look at that are called psalms, and psalms is just another word for song. There are lots of different types, and I've listed a couple here. This is in no way complete, and in no way do you look at a psalm and say, well, this is just one kind of psalm. There's a lot of ways that these can be intermixed within the same psalm. So one of the most common types of psalm that we have is what's called a psalm of lament. And lament is a lamentation is a crying out. It's how we deal with troubling situations. And so when problems come, the psalmist would write about, what he was feeling in these troubling times and how God generally is there to help him through these troubling times. We have psalms of praise that show us the God's attributes or his deeds. We see psalms of thanksgiving, which generally express gratitude for some kind of answered prayer. A very special type of psalm are called royal psalms, and these are psalms about the messianic kingship, how a godly king blesses the people. And we see a lot of these point us directly to Jesus, written well before his time, but a lot of these psalms are tell us about what the godly king who was to come is like. There's wisdom psalms that talk about what it means to live a godly life. And then one that sometimes gives us trouble is there's what we call imprecatory psalms. And these can be kind of hard to read sometimes, and we don't always understand, but sometimes these are psalms where the people of God are in such angst that they actually are asking God to judge his enemies, and sometimes in quite gruesome and violent ways. And sometimes people have problems with this, and like, how can we worship God when we're asking God to judge his enemies? Well, we actually do this quite a bit. Every week in our church we recite the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When we pray that, that's actually a prayer for God to bring his judgment and justice to the world. And so it's not quite as unusual as we might think. But when we're asking God to execute his judgment, that is something that we actually look forward to as Christians. When Jesus comes again, that's what's going to happen. So specifically, I wanted to look at some vocabulary that can sometimes seem strange to us, but will help us read, I think, the Psalms better and understand them a little better. So oftentimes the Psalms will refer to, in some way, the people of God. So sometimes it'll use words like Israel or Jacob or Judah. And those are all just words, again, talking about the covenant people of God. Okay, and today we would use words like the church or Christian. And even in the Old Testament, sometimes it will refer to the righteous. Okay? And these are all names that are meant for God's covenant people. So when we read those words, today we want to think about, okay, those promises, what the psalmist was saying to those folks is what applies to the church, to Christians today. Right? Counter that, not the people of God. The psalmist will talk about evildoers or wrongdoers, the wicked. Sometimes they will talk about specific countries like Edom or Moab, Tyre. Sometimes they'll just refer to the nations, which means everyone who's not a part of God's covenant people. So we have those two kind of competing groups that the psalmist will often talk about. Okay, so that's under the people of God and their counterparts, and then often, and this is very, very big in all of the wisdom literature, even in the prophets, in really the whole Bible, is that the idea of the presence of God is hugely important, and we'll see this as we talk about the other books in this lesson as well. The presence of God is of utmost importance to the people, to his covenant people. They want to be in God's presence, and that's what God wants with us. He wants to be in communion and presence with us too. Well, in the Old Testament, the presence of God was, either located in the tabernacle before the temple was built, or when the temple was built in Jerusalem. It was built on top of a mountain, and that mountain was referred to as Mount Zion. And that's where the temple was built. And so the presence of God is often referred to as Mount Zion or the temple. His holy hill, or my holy hill, God will say, the house of the Lord. All of that deals with where God's presence resides. Okay, and that's usually the biggest longing of the psalmist, is asking God's presence to be with them, or wanting to be where God is. The counter to that is, in the presence of the wicked, or in terms of death, it'll talk about the pit or Sheol. That's was seen as where people were away from God's presence. And again, this is a very key point that we make about how the mindset of the people of God worked, especially in writing this poetry and wisdom literature. And then also we see reference to the chosen of God, the Messiah of God, and it's often referred to as your Holy One, the Anointed One. Sometimes it's called the Messiah in Hebrew. But again, that was always looking toward the one who would come and redeem Israel, and who we know to be as Jesus. So these are some concepts that are probably a little unfamiliar to us, but should help us if we think through them as we're reading them, what it's talking about and what it really means for us. So if we look at an example, one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 121. And we see at the very beginning, it says a song of ascents. And what that is telling us, that's actually in the Bible, it's telling us that when this was written, again, we said the temple was set up on a hill on top of Mount Zion. And so as the worshipers would come, they would have to ascend the hill. And on their way to worship, they would be singing these psalms to prepare their hearts to go before into the presence of the Lord. And this psalm, again, if you notice, there are these double lines, these parallel lines that we see that happens often in Hebrew poetry. The first line says, "I lift up my eyes to the hills," and then the second line asks a question. It says, "From where does my help come?" Now we have to understand that if you're living in the Middle East at this time, okay, if you know me, you know that I like to go out walking in the hills. I go hiking quite a bit, and I feel quite safe there. Okay? But in the Middle East, at the time when this was written, hills were considered to be a very dangerous place to go. To go walking through the mountains, through the hills, is a way that you would be very much susceptible to ambush. Right? And when we think about Jesus talking about the the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan's on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho. Well, along that path, he probably was walking through the hills. That's where he was ambushed and um, taken advantage of. And so, the psalmist is saying, I see these hills before me that I have to walk through, and I'm scared. Where's my help going to come from? And he, in the second verse, he knows that he doesn't have to fear, because he says, my help comes from the Lord. And then the next line expands on that. Why does my help come from the Lord? Well, my help comes from the Lord because he made the heaven and the earth. And so verse 3 says, he will not let your foot be moved. Okay, so if you've ever been out hiking in the woods and you step on a rock and you can slip and fall, that's how I've often kind of hurt my ankles or something like that, because my foot was not secure in the place that I put it. And here the psalmist reminds us that God will not let our foot be moved. Our path, our feet on the path will be steady. God's gonna help us there. And it says, he who keeps you will not slumber. So we know that whenever we go through difficult times, that God is always going to be there watching our steps and helping keep our feet stable. And it says, behold, he who keeps Israel, again, here's Israel, the covenant people of God. He, the one who keeps Israel, keeps them safe, neither slumbers nor sleeps. That's a great bit of comfort when we think about having to walk into the hills, into dangerous places. And then this idea keeps expanding. The Lord, and here again, Lord is all capitalized. So we know that this is God's covenant name. That Yahweh is your keeper, and Yahweh is your shade on your right hand. If you've ever known anything about kings have bodyguards, right? And the king's most trusted bodyguard would be on his right hand, and he'd generally be a big strong man who would actually be big enough to provide shade to the king. And if you've ever heard the phrase, well, he's my right hand man. Okay, that's kind of what it's being referred to here. It's his most trusted protector. And here the psalmist is telling us that the Lord is our most trusted protector. The Lord is on our right hand. It says, the sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The two most powerful things that we have, in the sky during any time of day or night is either the sun or the moon. And even those things which shine down on the earth, God will keep you protected from. And indeed, the Lord will keep you from all evil, and he will keep your life. He will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. So it's really a great psalm that talks and encourages the people of God to have faith in God. And so, again, I hope you see that as this is being sung, as they're going to worship, despite what's going on in life, we know that we can trust in the Lord, who will keep us from evil because he loves us. So I want to switch now from Psalms and go into Proverbs. The Proverbs were likely written by Solomon, but we also know that there were some Proverbs that were added by other people. We see those generally at the end of the book. So we know that this was probably written sometime during Solomon's reign or shortly thereafter. And the wisdom of Proverbs seeks, again, to instruct the people of God, and indeed all people, all mankind, on how to live according to God's covenant law in various circumstances. Again, here's this art of godly living coming out. So it's the idea is that here's how we are to understand who God is and how to live in his world. So some of the great themes that we see in the book of Proverbs is that wisdom is not really an abstract thing. It's actually a very integral attribute of God himself. And in fact, it's the attribute that God employs when he's creating and maintaining the universe. That's why we know that the universe has order, because God created it not haphazardly, but through his wisdom. Right? And it's important to note that wisdom is not something that you're born with. It's not something that people generally just have without working at it. Wisdom is a skill that has to be sought out, practiced, and mastered. Okay, so again, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs is really a plea, almost like a father to a son, saying you need to seek out wisdom. You need to practice the art of godly living in all times, so that when you need it, it will be a skill that you have. So we see that living according to God's wisdom generally leads to a life that is happy and productive. You can be useful, you can be happy in life if you follow these basic precepts of wisdom. And that wisdom is available to all who seek it, and it can be applied to every aspect of life. Again, it has to be something that you seek out. It's not something that's going to happen just automatically. So, interestingly, in the book of Proverbs, we see that there are characters that Proverbs will use, personifications of various aspects of wisdom, or the lack thereof. So wisdom, in, again, the first about 9 chapters, is often depicted as a lady roaming the earth, calling out and offering her services to anyone that will use them. Okay, so wisdom is in the world. You can learn it. You can use wisdom if you're willing to seek it out. But opposite of the lady wisdom is the lady folly. Okay, and folly is kind of the opposite of wisdom. Okay, and it's, folly roams the earth, encouraging people to forsake wisdom and to seek out pleasure and leisure. Okay, to not exercise God's wisdom, but to live for yourself. And then we have, a group that's called the wise. Okay? Those who are wise are ones who embrace God's covenant laws from the heart and seek to live in the way of wisdom. But opposite that, there is what's called, the simple. Okay? The simple person is really a naive person, okay? A person who is easily influenced, and a person who is easily led. Okay? They don't work at finding wisdom. They just kind of go along with whatever somebody tells them or something that they hear. They don't, look for it in and of themselves. They don't seek it out and ask questions about it. It's just like, okay, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. That's the simple person. The fool, though, is the person who is opposed to doing God's covenant will. Okay, and it's important to note, we all can do foolish things, okay? But the fool is the one who is willfully choosing his own path. Okay, so I mean, you can be a generally wise person. You can be a person who seeks wisdom, but still, from time to time, we do foolish things. That doesn't make you a fool. It just means you did something foolish at that time. It's not something that characterizes your life. But for the fool and the scoffer and the one who is wise in their own eyes, this is, Proverbs makes it clear that this is a definite direction that people take willfully. Okay? So the scoffer is, again, a kind of like one step removed from the fool in the bad direction. The scoffer is more obstinate. The scoffer is one who does not accept correction. They do something foolish and somebody tries to tell them, say that wasn't wise. And they just, well, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to do what I want to do. And then kind of at the far end, in Proverbs, the most unsavory, savable person is the one who is wise in their own eyes. That person is not completely, but almost beyond hope. So as you read through Proverbs, you'll see these characters being described in various ways. But one of the very key parts of Proverbs, and it starts at the very beginning, is this idea of the fear of the Lord. Okay? Proverbs 1:7 tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Okay? And here's the second line. This is kind of the counter. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay? So those who are seeking wisdom, those who are seeking knowledge will fear the Lord. Opposite that, the fools despise wisdom and instruction. So we ask ourselves, well, what is this fear of the Lord? Well, most of us would know that we should have a very reverent respect for the Lord. But here's where the presence of the Lord that we talked about in the Psalms keeps coming into play, even in the wisdom literature. So the fear of the Lord also tells us that we need to have this intimate knowledge of the presence of the Lord with us. We look a little later in Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. So all your heart, all your ways, giving all of that to God is a sign that you have fear of the Lord, that he is intimate with you, you are intimate with him and his will. That's where we begin to have knowledge and wisdom. And then even with that intimate knowledge, it also implies a deep humility, because the very next verse 7, it says, watch this, be not wise in your own eyes. We said that the one who was wise in their own eyes was, the one who was almost beyond hope. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So don't be wise in your own eyes, and instead fear the Lord, turning away from evil. Again, that's knowing who God is and knowing the good that he has, rather than going toward the paths of evil. So there's a deep humility there that says, it's not my knowledge, it's not my wisdom that I'm seeking, it's the wisdom of God. I want to know his ways. So the fear of the Lord has, I think, at least these three ideas: that we need to have a reverent respect for God, an intimate knowledge of God and him of us, combined with a deep and abiding humility, that we're not looking to our own selves for help, but we fear the Lord. Okay, so the book of Proverbs tells us generally, if you behave this way, if you choose the path of wisdom, then things will generally go well for you. But we know from experience that doesn't always happen, right? And so that's why they're called Proverbs. They're not promises, they're Proverbs. They're sayings of the wise that say, generally, this is the way the world works. But we know for a fact, because we've lived in the world, that doesn't always happen. And so the book of Ecclesiastes kind of offers us a counter balance to Proverbs. Okay? Again, we don't know who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. It was possibly Solomon, but there's some argument about that. It generally is just referred to as the preacher or the teacher is talking there. We think that it's possibly Solomon who wrote this, but we don't know. Ecclesiastes again implores the reader to seek God's wisdom even when life is hard and confusing. So the book of Ecclesiastes recognizes that there are things that life doesn't always go the way it's supposed to. Right? So whereas Proverbs teaches us to seek out and employ wisdom in order to pursue a happy and useful life, Ecclesiastes recognizes that doesn't always happen. We live in a fallen and confusing world. The world is marred by sin. There's death in the world. And so when the teacher's talking about trying to understand life and experience life, he comes back to this vanity. He says, "Vanity of vanities, everything is vain." The word that he's using there is literally vapor or smoke. Okay, and we know that vapor is something that it's hard to see, and it's even harder to grasp. Right, so life can be hard, it can be confusing. Right, the race doesn't always go to the swift. The teacher says, you know, and regardless of what happens, there's this reality of sin and death in the world, right? And so our work and life has this tension. It work and life can be beautiful, but it can also be toilsome because of the reality of sin and death. And this reality that everybody's going to die, from the least to the greatest, it makes things very, very confusing. And the teacher is struggling with this. And so he goes through all of these struggles throughout the book, and looking at things and trying out different ways to live, seeing if anything makes sense. And what he comes down to at the very end of this, he says, despite the fact that everything is confusing and fallen and sinful, this should actually compel us and lead us back to fear God and to keep his covenant love. So Proverbs looks at the way the world should work in working with wisdom. Ecclesiastes, looks and says, sometimes things don't always go that way, and it makes things very confusing. And then we come to the book of Job, and Job says, but sometimes things get really out of hand, and it looks to understand the problem of suffering and God's sovereign justice. When we consider the story of Job, and you're probably familiar with this, is that we find out that the reason for human suffering is often unknowable. It says in the first two chapters of Job that Job was a righteous man. Job was so righteous that he would offer sacrifices on behalf of his sons for sins that they might have committed. So Job was a righteous person, and accordingly, he was also a very blessed person by God. And Satan comes before God and basically accuses, and that's what the word Satan means. It means adversary or accuser. And Satan says, well, sure, Job is going to follow you and fear you because you have blessed him. He's lived in a certain way. He's lived righteously, and you have blessed him. But Satan says, if you take all of that away, he will curse you. And God accepts that challenge in his wisdom. And so for the rest of the story, we see Job, who is a righteous man, he becomes afflicted by tragedy upon tragedy. He loses everything except his own life. But even his own life is marred by boils and sores and everything. And so, we have this question: was Job only acting righteously because he was being blessed by God? And, for the next, 30 some chapters, Job complains that, God is very evident in his suffering, but he's not giving him a lot of comfort. He doesn't understand why this is happening to him. And he has some friends who try to comfort him, but it's often to no avail. His friends come and say, well, we know that God is just. And if God is just, then why is this happening to Job? Well, Job must have in some way sinned in order to receive this kind of punishment from God. And what we see in this book is that's really not the case. Job maintains, he says, look, I haven't sinned. All of these things you're accusing me of, my good friends, are not true. I am innocent. And Job becomes very, very aggravated and intense in his despair, and he actually demands that God appear before him, and that God should answer for why this is happening. And in the case of, be careful what you wish for, God does show up. Okay? And he appears before Job in this, storm, but he doesn't answer Job's question. Instead, he basically admits, Job was right. But at the same time, God shows Job a glimpse of the universe, of the majesty and complexity of the universe. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Can you really understand how complex the whole universe is, and you think you can understand why this is happening to you? And God goes on for a couple of chapters, just laying on the complexity and the majesty of creation and all of the ways that things are intertwined in the world. And God says, can you handle this? Could you handle this for even a day? Are you really in a position to make demands on me? And Job realizes, basically says, look, I stuck my foot in my mouth. And he recants his accusation when he is in the presence of God. And here's that theme again. The presence of God changes everything for the believer in God. Because when we see that God is with us, right, and we are in his presence, everything else kind of falls away. And we even see this, brought out in, Paul writes in Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13. He talks about all of the things that he suffered. And he says, look, I have learned to be content whether I have plenty or whether I am in want. Okay? And so we see Job lived in plenty. Job had a lot of want, and Job continued to live in the fear of the Lord. And Paul says in Philippians 4, 11 through 13, I know what it is to have plenty. I know what it is to be in want. And then we have the verse that says, for I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Okay? So Paul's not talking about, well, I can go out and, run a marathon because, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul is saying something much, much greater than that. He says, look, I can live through anything that God puts me through, that anything that comes my way. I know that I can live in a way that is pleasing to God through any circumstances because I know I have Christ in me. I have that presence of God with me, and that's how I can do all things. And that it's more talking about the things that come upon us. And so at the end of the story, we see that God restores to Job double of everything that he lost, not as a reward for his righteous living, but just as a gracious gift. So it's again not saying, if you live this way, you're going to be blessed, which is what Proverbs basically tells us, that we can live a happy and useful, productive life if we follow that. Job had been doing that all along, and yet God allowed calamity to come into his life. And then God also restored everything that he had. It was not based anything on what Job had done, but it was based on God's wisdom and holy will. All right. And that finally leads us to the last book in today's lesson, called the Song of Solomon. Okay. And the author it could be Solomon who wrote this. Again, we're not exactly sure. It speaks of Solomon at times, but we don't know that if it actually was written by him or not. But the book itself extols the beauty of marital intimacy as a picture of God's desire to be intimately known by his covenant people through the covenant. Okay, so again, here is the presence of God, that theme coming out again in this wisdom literature. And here it's likened to marital intimacy. And this book, if you've never read it, is very, very explicit in how it talks about this marital love. And this is why marriage is a very, very important thing in the eyes of the Bible, because God's covenant relationship with his people is it demands purity and faithfulness. Okay? When God's people go after other idols, the Bible uses the term whoring. It's going after prostitutes. It's going after whores, and not being faithful to that covenant relationship. So we see, here and through the rest of Scripture, that marriage fidelity is a very, very important theme. The relationship between a husband and a wife, rightly practiced, is to represent God's covenantal love and care for his people. Okay, that's hugely important, because this happens all the way through the Bible, from Genesis all the way to Revelation and everywhere in between. The relationship between a husband and a wife, rightly practiced, is to be a symbol, a tangible representation of God's covenantal love that he has for his people. Okay? It's no mistake that the first miracle that Jesus is recorded to have done was at a marriage ceremony. And indeed, when Mary comes to him and says, "Hey, there's a problem that needs your help," Jesus looks at her and says, "Wait, it's just my time hasn't come. My hour is not yet here. In this marriage, kind of ceremony. This isn't my marriage, right?" And that's what we see in Revelation 19 and 20, is we see this marriage supper of the Lamb, where Jesus comes back and is united with his bride, the church, in this great marriage ceremony. So in this way, we see that marriage is a very precious gift from God that should be treated with the utmost respect and faithfulness at all times. This is hugely important in this book. And again, if you read it, this is one of those things that it's not rated PG. It's very, very explicit in its language of the beauty of marital love. So I invite you to explore that on your own. So for our next lesson, we're going to be looking at what we call the major prophets. And again, we have major and minor prophets, and those are not distinctions of importance, as if what the major prophets said was really important and the minor prophets were only somewhat important. They're all very important. Generally, we refer to these five as the major prophets because of the length to which they wrote. These are generally the longer books. The minor prophets are generally shorter. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel are the five books of what we call the major prophets. And if you'd like to get a head start on those, you can read the introductions to those for next time. Thanks for joining us this morning. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.